Something is shifting beneath the surface, and if you've been feeling it, you're not imagining it. This is not silence. This is not distance without meaning. This is the moment where something unresolved is finally beginning to move inside them. A decision is forming, quietly but powerfully, in a place no one else can see. And once it fully surfaces, nothing between you will stay the same. Something is shifting beneath the surface, and if you've been sensing it, that quiet, persistent pressure in your intuition like something is about to change, you're not imagining it. There is a decision taking shape inside them right now, a real one. Not a casual choice made in passing, not something spoken lightly over everyday moments, but a slow, private unfolding in the deepest layers of their inner world. And without either of you saying a single word, that decision is connected to you. From the outside, they may seem unchanged, calm, detached, maybe even colder than before, as if nothing is happening at all. But that exterior is misleading. Internally, something they have been avoiding for a long time has become too heavy to ignore. Pushing it away is no longer working. And this is where most people misunderstand what is actually going on. This is not only about whether they miss you, or whether they return, or whether they leave for good. It runs far deeper than that. What's unfolding is about what your connection awakened in them, what it exposed within their identity, what it forced them to feel when avoidance was no longer possible. Because certain connections don't stay on the surface. They don't pass through a person cleanly. They sink in, they linger, and at some point they demand an internal response. Right now, they are standing at a threshold moment, a turning point in the most literal sense. They are facing something within themselves that could alter the entire direction of their life. And whether they move toward you or step away, they will not leave this moment unchanged. The tension you've been feeling has a source. The distance has a source. Even the silence carries meaning. Nothing about this is random. Beneath it all is an inner conflict that has been building quietly for a long time and is now reaching its peak intensity. What comes next will reveal more than words ever could. It will reveal who they are when comfort is gone, when avoidance stops working, when fear no longer has anywhere to hide. What you're sensing is not imagination dressed up as intuition. It is the subtle impact of someone wrestling with themselves because something about you reached parts of them they rarely allow to be touched. In their private thoughts, every direction they consider eventually loops back to the same place. Back to you, back to what was felt, back to what was never fully resolved or understood. For a long time, they tried to outpace it. They kept themselves busy. They leaned on routines, responsibilities, distractions, pride, and distance. They tried to shrink what they felt into something manageable, something temporary that would fade if ignored long enough. They convinced themselves it was just intensity, and intensity always settles. But real connection doesn't obey convenience. It doesn't dissolve simply because someone wants it to. And the more they tried to suppress it, the more it resurfaced in unexpected moments, refusing to stay buried. What existed between you was never superficial. It didn't just skim the edges of who they are, it reached deeper layers, the parts not governed by logic, planning, or discipline, the parts that don't easily change just because life becomes complicated. Now, they are doing something they didn't anticipate. They are reevaluating everything, not only what you meant to them, but what this connection reveals about their emotional truth, their patterns, and who they are becoming. The real decision is not simply whether to stay or leave. At its core, it is whether they are willing to face themselves honestly. That is where the resistance comes from. One part of them feels drawn toward you in a way that doesn't require explanation. It feels natural, almost gravitational. Your absence doesn't register as relief. It registers as something unresolved, something unfinished, something that keeps resurfacing in quiet moments, no matter how much they try to focus elsewhere. But another part of them resists that pull with equal force, because acknowledging it fully would require vulnerability they have not practiced in a long time. It would mean abandoning the image of control they rely on. It would mean choosing emotional truth over emotional protection. And that kind of shift is unsettling. It disrupts old defenses. It challenges the identity they built to stay safe. It demands they step forward without certainty. That is why everything feels heavier now. Why the silence feels louder. Why the connection feels more present, even in absence. They are no longer only avoiding the truth, they are beginning to sit with it. And sitting with what you've spent a long time avoiding changes a person. They are asking themselves questions they can't easily dismiss. Why do you keep appearing in their thoughts? Why do quiet moments drift back to you? Why has nothing else quite filled the space you left behind? These are not passing thoughts. They are persistent questions, the kind that repeat until something inside is forced to respond honestly. This is the stage right before clarity, a point where internal tension becomes too consistent to ignore. Eventually, something gives way. The controlled distance starts to feel less like a choice and more like effort. The mask becomes harder to maintain, and what follows that breaking point is truth, whatever form it takes. If they come back toward you, it will not be because everything suddenly became easy. It will be because they recognize something real, something that doesn't appear often, something that requires discomfort to approach honestly. And if they don't return, it will not be a reflection of your value. It will not erase what was real between you. It will only reveal that they were not ready for the level of emotional honesty and inner transformation this connection required. That limitation belongs to them, not to you, which is why the only grounded position right now is not pursuit, not pressure, not forcing outcomes in a situation that is still unfolding internally. Step back from trying to control what is still becoming clear. Let truth surface at its own pace. Let time expose what force cannot accelerate. Inside them, two forces continue to move in opposition. One is the pull toward you, familiar, emotional, instinctive, tied to memory and meaning. The other is an old, protective structure built from past experiences where openness led to disappointment, where trust came at a cost. And right now, those two forces are still in conflict, shaping everything that feels uncertain between you. That voice keeps telling them to stay behind the wall, to stay guarded, to stay distant, to stay safe at any cost. And for a long time, those two internal forces have been colliding quietly in the background. But lately, the impact between them has become impossible to ignore. On the surface, life may look unchanged. They are still functioning, still showing up, still appearing composed, maybe even indifferent at times. But that outward calm is not the full picture. Because the more they try to suppress what's happening inside, the more strongly it returns. This was never just a conflict playing out in the external world. It has always been internal, and that is exactly why what unfolds next carries more weight than it may appear to from the outside. You became something in their life they did not anticipate. Even without clear words defining it at the time, this connection disrupted the structure they had built around themselves for safety. It reached beneath the surface layer, the version of them that is managed, curated, and carefully controlled, and touched something more unfiltered, more real. Now they are standing at a dividing point. One path is to remain exactly as they are, within the familiar boundaries of who they have always been. The other is to move toward a version of themselves that requires openness, emotional risk, and a kind of courage they have not had to access in a long time. Neither option feels easy. That is why this moment feels so draining from within. A shift is already underway, even if it is quiet. And what makes it significant is not something dramatic happening externally, but the internal pressure reaching a level where it can no longer stay balanced. There comes a point in any internal struggle where holding both opposing truths becomes heavier than choosing one. They are approaching that point now. Not because something outside forced it, but because the mind cannot indefinitely sustain contradiction without eventually leaning in one direction. For a long time, they managed this by downplaying what they felt, convincing themselves it was temporary, that it could be controlled, that distance and time would eventually dissolve it. But emotions rooted in something meaningful do not remain contained forever. They continue developing beneath the surface, even when ignored. And now they are resurfacing more insistently. Not in a controlled or predictable way, but in sudden waves, late at night, in quiet moments, in the gaps between distractions when nothing else is demanding attention. In those moments, their thoughts drift toward you without effort. Not as a choice, but as a pattern that keeps repeating itself. Your absence plays a role in this, because when you stepped back, you did not simply remove yourself from their immediate environment. You left space, and that space did not stay empty. It became reflective. It forced them to sit with what your presence had been quietly providing all along. The steadiness, the emotional warmth, the sense of being seen in a way that does not require explanation. And once someone experiences the shape of what is missing, the internal question begins to change. It is no longer, did this matter? It becomes something more uncomfortable. Did I recognize its value too late? In their private mind, comparisons begin to happen naturally, not always deliberate, not always conscious, but consistent, between what it felt like with you and what it feels like elsewhere. And the difference does not fade, it repeats itself. This is not idealization, it is recognition of depth, of how your presence affected their emotional state, how it made them feel more awake within themselves, more connected, more present. That is why this process is not static, it is reshaping them internally. Remaining halfway, neither fully engaged nor fully detached, no longer feels sustainable. It creates more internal strain than relief. And slowly, they are beginning to understand that avoidance is no longer a solution. It is just delay. Inside them now, fear and longing are no longer separated. They are confronting each other directly. On one side is the pull toward you, familiar, grounded, instinctive, something that does not require explanation. On the other is fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of exposure, fear of losing control, fear of repeating older emotional injuries that taught them to associate openness with pain. That fear may not even belong entirely to the present situation. It may be built from older experiences where trust was broken or emotional honesty was not handled safely. But regardless of its origin, it has been influential for a long time. What is changing now is that desire is starting to rise louder than that fear. And that is not a small internal shift. That is the beginning of movement from protection toward honesty. It explains the intensity of the push and pull. One moment, there is the pull toward emotional surrender, the idea of no longer resisting what already exists within them. The next moment, fear reasserts itself, re-establishing distance. Both feel real. That is what makes the conflict so destabilizing. They are not choosing between something true and something false. They are choosing between two emotionally real responses, and so they remain suspended, not because they do not feel, but because they are overwhelmed by the internal pressure of feeling too much in opposing directions. But that state cannot last indefinitely. There is always a point where one force becomes dominant enough to break the equilibrium. When that happens, they will either allow fear to keep them restrained and distant, or they will allow their deeper emotional truth to guide them towards something uncertain but real. And at its core, this is not only about connection, it is about identity, about who they are becoming, about whether they continue as someone who prioritizes safety above all else, or someone willing to step into emotional truth even when it feels unfamiliar. That turning point is approaching. They have been circling the same thoughts for a long time now, replaying memories, analyzing meanings, searching for clarity through logic. But this is not a problem that resolves through analysis alone. Emotional truth does not wait for perfect reasoning. It builds pressure until it forces acknowledgement, and as that pressure increases, their behavior may shift. They may appear more distant at times, more inward, more inconsistent. But that is not absence. It is internal processing. Sometimes distance is not disinterest. Sometimes it is the final stage of an internal decision forming under pressure. What is becoming clear to them now is that the middle ground is no longer protecting them. It is exhausting them. Being neither fully in nor fully out does not reduce pain. It distributes it across every moment. And so, they are being pushed towards something unavoidable, taking responsibility for what they feel instead of continuing to manage it from a safe emotional distance. That kind of honesty removes every comfortable hiding place. It forces them to face a question they've been avoiding for a long time. whether they're willing to risk the familiar version of their life for something that requires them to grow beyond who they've been allowed themselves to be. A sense of finality is forming in all of this. The phase of uncertainty, of maybe later, of staying in emotional limbo, is beginning to fade. What replaces it is something far more demanding, clarity that can no longer be postponed. Whatever this connection is, they already understand it isn't insignificant. It isn't a fleeting attraction or a temporary emotional chapter that fades on its own. It has weight, it has meaning. And because of that, the hesitation that once felt like protection is starting to feel more like confinement. They are beginning to realize that avoiding a decision was never true safety. It was simply stasis, and staying emotionally stuck for too long becomes its own form of discomfort. For a long time, they were effective at managing what they felt. Logic acted as their defense. Distance became their habit. Silence turned into their default response. But emotions that are rooted in something real cannot be indefinitely controlled through avoidance. Eventually, when a person is left alone with their thoughts long enough, truly alone, without distraction or escape, what is real begins to rise to the surface. And that is exactly what is happening now. This is not being driven by outside pressure. It is coming from within them. Something that was suppressed is beginning to reawaken, and it no longer responds to rational arguments meant to diminish it. They can no longer fully rely on "I'm not sure" as a defense. Your presence has become too consistent in their inner world for uncertainty to hold the same weight it once did. This is a turning point. Because when someone starts to miss not only who you are, but who they were in your presence, the question subtly changes. It is no longer about whether something mattered. That part is already understood. The real question becomes whether they are willing to face what that connection revealed within them. And in this stage, something very honest begins to happen. The silence they maintained starts reflecting them back to themselves. It shows them where fear influenced decisions, where pride replaced vulnerability, and where avoidance quietly shaped outcomes they now have to revisit with fuller awareness. They are remembering moments, conversations, and pauses, but now with a level of emotional maturity they didn't have at the time. What once seemed confusing is becoming clearer in hindsight. What once felt manageable is now revealing its emotional cost. This isn't just regret forming, it is a reordering of values. The things they once prioritized, control, image, emotional self-protection, are beginning to feel less meaningful compared to the reality of something that was emotionally real and alive. And alongside that shift, another one is quietly developing: empathy. They are starting to understand, more clearly than before, what their distance may have felt like from your side. What it means to be on the receiving end of emotional absence. What it costs someone to remain open when the other person withdraws. That kind of awareness changes how someone relates to their own actions. It becomes harder to dismiss behavior once you fully understand its impact on another person. Responsibility begins to enter the picture, and with it, the internal narrative starts to change. They are no longer only reacting to fear, they are beginning to reflect on who they are becoming through those reactions. At this stage, something more serious takes shape internally, not dramatic, but definite. A recognition that whatever comes next will reflect something real about the kind of person they are choosing to be. The softer language of maybe, someday, and I'll think about it begins to lose influence. In its place, something more grounded forms, a sense of necessity. Not pressure from outside, but an internal realization that avoidance is no longer neutral. It is costly. They are also beginning to feel time differently, less infinite, more finite, more valuable. And that awareness changes how decisions feel internally. What once felt like something that could be delayed indefinitely now feels like something that carries consequence in every moment of delay. Even physically, this shows up, not just as thought, but as sensation. Tension when they consider reaching out, discomfort when they imagine being honest, resistance when they try to remain unchanged. The unknown still carries fear, but the known emptiness of continuing as they are is beginning to feel even heavier. That shift, what they fear more, often marks the beginning of movement. Words that were previously withheld begin to press closer to expression. Actions that once felt impossible start to feel unavoidable. Because once internal truth reaches a certain level of intensity, silence stops functioning as protection. It starts feeling like strain. And it is important to understand this clearly. Whatever comes next will not be impulsive. It will come from a long internal process of confrontation, meeting themselves without the protection of excuses or distance. That is why this moment carries significance. Not because of drama, but because of honesty finally becoming unavoidable. At the center of it all is a simple but powerful truth. You changed something in them. You revealed something about their emotional capacity, their depth, their potential for connection that they have not been able to fully ignore. Even in silence, that impact has remained. Now the internal noise is beginning to settle. Confusion is starting to separate from clarity. What remains is something harder to dismiss: recognition. They are realizing that suppression does not remove feeling, it only delays its acknowledgement. What was pushed down has not disappeared. It has grown in the background, quietly gaining strength until it demands attention. And now it is visible. When truth becomes visible, it asks for a response. Not confusion, not delay, a response. Whatever they choose next, whether they move toward connection or choose a different direction, it will not come from uncertainty anymore. It will come from clarity. And clarity changes everything. So if you have been sensing a shift, trust that perception. Something internal is reaching its final stage of becoming clear. A decision is forming, not from confusion but from recognition of what can no longer be ignored. The quiet before that decision is often the most telling part of the entire process. In the end, everything comes down to this. Truth can only stay buried for so long before it begins to rise on its own. What started as uncertainty has now become awareness. What once felt confusing is slowly becoming clear. The distance, the silence, the hesitation, it was never emptiness. It was internal conflict, reaching a point where it could no longer remain unresolved. And now, something irreversible is happening inside them. The excuses are losing strength. The emotional noise is settling. And what remains underneath it all is something simple, undeniable, and real. A recognition of what you meant, a recognition of what they felt, and a recognition that staying in denial is no longer sustainable. This is the turning point where avoidance stops being possible and honesty becomes the only path forward. Not because everything is easy, but because everything hidden has finally become too heavy to ignore. Whatever direction they choose from here will no longer come from confusion. It will come from clarity, from a place where truth can no longer be unseen or unfelt. And that is the real conclusion of this entire journey. Not certainty about what they will do next, but certainty that they can no longer pretend they don't know what is real. What happens now will simply reveal whether they are willing to act on it.